Okay, I haven't seen it.
Thank you, Chair. It's the same question to both speakers. The United Kingdom has a large population, one of the largest populations in Europe, and it's likely that after Brexit, the environment for food is likely to become mixed. And I mean by that we won't go down one route, we'll go down several routes. And I can see a scenario in which richer and better off people buy a lot of UK-produced food with a very high animal welfare standard and a very high quality. And that another, maybe a third of the population who are on low incomes have no choice really other than to go down the cheap food route. And clearly outside of the European Union, there's a distinct possibility that we'll start importing a large amount of cheaper food. I mean, it's been one of the arguments put forward by some in the Conservative Party is that in a free trade environment, we'll be able to go into the world market and buy cheaper food, and that customers will be able to have cheaper food. But I think we all know that cheaper food often is not necessarily produced to a high animal welfare standard. It's not necessarily nutritious. And the real danger, of course, is that it's not produced to a high enough safety level, and that's where we start to have problems with disease, etc. And just to get your views as to whether you think this is potentially a real scenario, that we won't all start buying cheap food in the United Kingdom, but some people will buy it because they will always buy the cheapest. But a lot of people, unfortunately, will have no choice but to buy the cheapest food. That will grow the market for cheap food and everything that goes with it, the downside that I've just outlined. Would you agree or disagree?
I think on the last question, if I should just take that as well. Now I'm on the microphone. I think there is a potential risk that we definitely see consumers and also retailers actually trying in the UK to improve food standards in many ways. It's actually, in my time in the UK, actually been a way for many retailers and competitors and ourselves to differentiate in the marketplace, actually to provide affordable products at a higher food standard. But of course, in a scenario where milk products will be missing in the UK and could put pressure on inflation, a scenario where lower standard food, cheaper food is coming into the marketplace could of course happen. And I think that's also why we are saying it's critical that the food and the safety standards and law needs to be the same. So there is a minimum that everyone complies with basically to take care of the consumers.
Thank you. If I could just respond to the last two questions as well, which were relating to standards and consumer protection issues. In terms of whether or not we've had assurances from government on food labelling and protection, I think at a very general level, the government has been saying at the moment that it doesn't intend to weaken consumer protection and that it wants to uphold standards. But there hasn't been detailed discussion about what that means in practice yet, which is why we still want to emphasise that it's really important that food and consumer interests are prioritised. As I mentioned in my presentation, the EU withdrawal bill, which is going through the House of Commons and then will soon go to the House of Lords, is intended to replicate and bring in all EU legislation into UK law. But the issues that I highlighted around risk assessment capacity and around enforcement issues, they all relate very much to the nature of the relationship that we have with the EU. So I understand that the Food Standards Agency, for example, in the UK has been looking at some of those issues, but there aren't really clear plans or decisions made about whether or not the Food Standards Agency needs to suddenly have scientific committees or whether it will cooperate with EFSA, for example. So those are the kinds of things that we feel really need to be sorted out as soon as possible and make sure that it's clear how we'll be cooperating.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Chair. The Common Agricultural Policy has been a mixed blessing for the environment, which is something that this committee is well aware of. If you speak to environmentalists, they will say the Common Agricultural Policy is not fit for purpose. Outside of the EU, the United Kingdom, is no longer bound by the Common Agricultural Policy. I'm finding this difficult to actually articulate as a Remainer, but I accept that there are potentially some benefits for the environment outside of the Common Agricultural Policy. What do you think potentially are the big wins for the UK and the island of islands environment outside of the EU and outside of the Common Agricultural Policy?
Are there any scenarios for improving environmental standards, I think was one question. Is that within the UK or within... I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why leaving the EU would necessarily mean that we would see worse standards, and there are opportunities available to push ahead for more ambitious standards. And we see within the nations of the UK, Scotland and Wales, for example, have more ambitious policies in relation to climate change than the UK does nationally. However, in a study that myself and some colleagues from the University of East Anglia and Queen's University, Belfast did, we tried to analyse the counterfactual. So how does the UK behave when it's not subject to EU rules and laws? So we had a case study looking at planning law, which has traditionally been less Europeanised than other areas of UK environmental policy. And what we found, unsurprisingly, is that the concern for the environment was much lower in that sector, and that economic priorities tended to trump environmental ones as legislation was designed. What we also see within the UK is that where there's, in relation to wildlife protection, quite often it might be that it's UK law that's relied on rather than EU law. And if you talk to people from the Wildlife Trust, they will say they would always rather it was EU law because it's clear, it's enforceable and the standards are higher. If you're relying on UK law, then it tends to be phrased in a less straightforward way. And again, economic priorities tend to trump environmental ones. So whilst there's no necessary reason why there wouldn't be more ambitious environmental policy, historically, regardless of the government that's in power, that isn't something that the UK has done. And we have always been able to push ahead with more environmental ambitious standards, and we've done that in relation to climate change, for example. So there is scope to do that. The other point I would make about the EU is that it provides longer timeframes and more stable policy frameworks. And what we may see happening is that environmental policy becomes more subject to swings up and down depending upon elections and who's in office.